I'm Haley B. Miller, and this is Ohio Politics Explained, a podcast where you give us 15 minutes and we give you all the news you need to sound smart and impress your friends.
Welcome back to another episode of Ohio Politics Explained with our guest, retired FBI agent Jeff Williams. In previous episodes, Jeff walked us through the House Bill 6 case, the arrest of Larry Householder, and the corrupting influence of dark money in politics. That interview was such a hit with our listeners that we invited Jeff back on the show to walk us through a couple other interesting public corruption cases in Ohio. Thanks, Jeff, for joining us again.
Great to be here, Laura.
So we're going to talk about the Amer Ahmad case. Up until the Householder and House Bill 6 case, Ahmad had been my all-time career favorite story. It's just so interesting. It has so many twists and turns. He was a very charismatic, smart guy he worked in the Ohio Treasurer's office. And the story includes his escape to Pakistan via Mexico and a journal that he titled My Journey to Freedom. Let me give a quick recap. Rich Cordray had hired Ahmad into the Treasurer's office. And then when Rich Cordray became the Attorney General in a special election after Mark Dan, Democrat, resigned, then Governor Ted Strickland appointed Kevin Boyce as the new treasurer to serve out the rest of Rich Cordray's term. And Boyce had been on the Columbus City Council, and Ahmad remained in the treasurer's office, and Boyce ended up promoting him to deputy treasurer. So how did Ahmad use that power in the treasurer's office?
Well, he used that power as part of this scheme to have a change in trading strategy. Shortly after he was named deputy treasurer, he had already held the title of CFO for the state. He came up with a trading strategy where they were going to be much more active in their trading of these large pension funds.
Yeah, like a lot more churn, right?
A lot more churn. And he specifically had put forth a strategy that involved the use of 7 firms. And some of these firms are the biggest firms in the business, like JP Morgan Chase and William Blair. But also on this list happened to be Hampton Capital Management, run by Doug Hampton. And it just so happens that Doug Hampton went to high school with Amer Ahmad in Canton, and Doug Hampton had been Ahmad's personal financial advisor since back in 1996. So a full 10 years prior to being here in this position as deputy treasurer and CFO.
How did this arrangement, this new trading policy and being on the list, how did that help Doug Hampton?
Well, Doug Hampton had never made more than, say, $100,000 in commissions on trades with the state. And in the very short period of time, really about a year and a half after Ahmad had come up with this strategy for so much more churn, as you say, Doug Hampton got the preponderance of all those trades. When you look back statistically at the number of trades that were done, the vast majority of them were done out of those 7 core trading groups that Ahmad proposed. The vast majority were done by one, and that was Hampton Capital Management. 360 trades, and for executing 360 trades, Doug Hampton got in excess of $3.2 million in commissions paid by the state to do those trades.
How did he kick back some of that $3.2 million to Ahmad?
Well, again, this is probably why you find this case so fascinating, as did we, and satisfying. Ahmad was Harvard educated, very smart, very savvy, and there was elaborate ways in which they laundered the money. So in total, around $520,000 came back to Ahmad from Doug Hampton. And it was generally in 2 ways. The first way was a fellow by the name of Mohammed Noor Allo, who was an immigration attorney in Columbus and a very, very close friend of Amer Ahmad. It was an agreement amongst the co-conspirators that there would be a bogus or fictitious agreement, retainer agreement, and legal services agreement between Allo's law firm and Doug Hampton. So in reality, in 2009, there were no legal services that Allo provided to Doug Hampton. Nevertheless, he sent an invoice to Doug Hampton for $123,000, which Hampton paid to Noor Allo. Now, again, importantly, He didn't pay it into an attorney trust account, or he didn't pay it to the law firm. He just paid that money personally to Nur Allo, and then Nur Allo kicked back cash and monies to Amer Ahmad. The second way gets even more crazy, and as the story goes, Amer Ahmad is admiring his yard that's being cut by Joe Chivaroli, the owner of Going Green Landscape, and approaches Joe Chivaroli and tells him that he's always admired the lawn cutting business and wanted to know if he wanted to have an investor in the business. And Chivaroli agrees. And ultimately, the arrangement evolved into basically just a money laundering scheme for Amer Ahmad. So Ahmad acquired a 44% interest in Going Green and named himself the vice president. And ultimately, Doug Hampton gave about $400,000, which was purported to be investments and investment monies going into Going Green, but in reality, they were not. There was a fake promissory note that was executed, which again was just fake, and a veneer to cover up the fact that they were laundering the kickbacks, the bribes that were going from Hampton to Amer Ahmad. And so these monies flowed into Going Green Landscape, and Chivaroli would take portions of those out, and Ahmad would take portions of those out for themselves, the preponderance going to Ahmad. And that is how the cycle or the circle of the bribery kickback scheme worked.
Now, the convictions came on the Hampton kickback scheme, but there was, how and why did Ahmad end up on the FBI's radar in the first place? I thought it had something to do with Boston-based State Street Bank, which is a massive bank that was trying to retain its business with some of the state pension funds.
It's a great question because it goes back to, again, why do we open certain investigations? Why do we target particular folks? What is the information or the predication that allows us to get to the threshold of opening an investigation? And in this particular instance, it was one of these co-conspirators. It was the fellow I mentioned, the immigration attorney, Mohammed Nur Allo. Back in 2010, he had made a phone call and left a voicemail message with Bank of New York Mellon. At the time, Bank of New York Mellon had the contracts to manage the custodian accounts of the pension funds, numerous pension funds in the state of Ohio. And Allo had called Bank of New York Mellon and left this voicemail that indicating that he heard that those fund accounts were coming up for renewal, for bidding, and that they may not get them again, and that he had done lobbying in the state before, and that he wanted to let them know that he could offer his services and that may help them retain these accounts. Now, the interesting thing here is he's obviously a very close friend to Amer Ahmad. He's an immigration attorney. He had never done any lobbying before in the state. Places like Bank of New York Mellon and the bank that you mentioned out of Boston, State Street Bank, are very, very large institutional investor banks with a bevy of lawyers and lobbyists that work for them. But, that shakedown, if you will, where he is, and by the way, just in that voicemail in and of itself, he's divulging all sorts of information. Not only is he, in essence, shaking down Bank of New York Mellon, he's showing that he has insider information. Now, we know now, since he's pled guilty, that he got that information from Amer Ahmad, but it never would have been publicly known about who the respondents were, the bidders were on these contracts, when exactly all this was going on, how to get a hold of different people at different banks. This was all inside information at the Treasurer's office that this random immigration attorney in Columbus had. So that is why we opened the case. We opened the case initially looking at was there any extortion or bribery arrangement going on involving the management of the pension funds in the state.
Yeah, I remember writing a story in May of 2010 for the Dayton Daily News. Somebody had pointed out to me that State Street Bank had hired Nur Allo as its lobbyist. And it was really curious because it's like, here's an immigration attorney from Columbus, Ohio with no lobbying experience and no banking experience, but he did have these connections too. So it turns out that, Kevin Boyce did not win statewide election. He lost to Republican Josh Mandel. And when Josh Mandel's team arrived, a federal subpoena awaited them. How did the Mandela administration respond to the federal request for information?
They were cooperative. And I don't think they had any reason not to be cooperative. It was a prior administration of a different political party. And so they were cooperative and responsive to our subpoena.
Were they instrumental in helping the FBI uncover this Hampton kickback scheme? It kind of seemed like it shifted from the pension fund's global custody agreement and State Street Bank and more onto the kickback. They
were helpful, but I really, the big break and all the credit goes to the analysts and the case agents at the FBI and the federal prosecutors working on this case, both at the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Columbus. And in this particular case, there were federal prosecutors that were brought in to assist from U.S. Department of Justice Public Integrity Section. And it was their collective team effort in doing the financial review and analysis of Amer Ahmad's finances and trying to understand, where Going Green fit in and who's Doug Hampton and some of these things that started to come up on the radar screen while we were looking at the validity of the allegations involving the pension fund accounts. And I should mention, and I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself, the pension fund issue was addressed by the SEC. So there were two individuals, one who was a lobbyist that worked for State Street Bank. There was an executive at State Street Bank. And then the bank itself entered into agreements with the SEC where there were punitive penalties. I think State Street was about $12 million in penalty. Some of that was fines and penalties, and some was disgorgement. And that was the resolution of that aspect of the case.
So, after Kevin Boyce lost to Josh Mandel in November of 2010, Ahmad returned to Chicago, where he had worked before, and he became the city comptroller under then Mayor Rahm Emanuel. And eventually, Ahmad resigned to pursue other interests, and the mayor's administration issued a friendly press release wishing him well. But then, I remember just a few weeks later, boom, federal charges came against Ahmad, Alu, Hampton, and Joe, the lawn guy. And Hampton and the lawn guy, they were the first to flip. I think that was in August or so of 2011. And eventually, both Ahmad and Alu pleaded guilty. What happened next while they were awaiting sentencing?
And, the investigation was covert for a while with a lot of the things we were looking at behind the scenes, but ultimately we went overt. For example, we first questioned Ahmad himself in September of 2012, and that was part of the charging document. During the course of his time with us, he lied. Later in subsequent proffer agreements, but initially that's the basis of part of the indictment were false statements that he had made regarding Going Green Landscape. We had already known about all of that when we interviewed him in 2012. And then just one clarification of a point that you just made. So Doug Hampton was the first one. He actually was not indicted. So we had, again, at about this time, had approached some of the subjects, and Hampton had agreed to plead guilty. So he was not indicted. He pled to a bill of information and was cooperative from the very beginning. And he actually pled guilty a couple of days before the indictment, and that was in August, but it was in 2013.
Okay.
And Hampton pled guilty, and then the indictment came out a few days later, and the indictment included Joe Chivaroli, Mohammed Noor Allo, and Amer Ahmad for a variety of charges, the false statements that Ahmad made, but like you had discussed before, bribery, money laundering, and other charges.
And so I remember it happened, I think, in the week between Christmas and New Year's that Ahmad and Alu did finally plead guilty, and they were, sent back home to await sentencing in federal court. What happened shortly before Ahmad was expected to report for sentencing?
It's a great question. And again, a reason why you this is one of your favorite cases. You just really can't make this stuff up. This is made for podcast material. So Ahmad pled guilty on December 23rd, I think, of 2013. And again, most of the time in the federal system, if you are a nonviolent white collar offender, if you are found guilty at trial or plead guilty, you are not remanded into custody immediately to the U.S. Marshals.
And you don't get a Lindsay Lohan bracelet either?
You might, depending on the conditions of release. Your passport may be taken, it may not. You may get a bracelet, you may not, just depending on the circumstances. And we talked about in one of the prior podcasts sort of the unusualness of Larry Householder, how at his sentencing he was remanded to custody immediately. So after Ahmad had pled guilty and pending sentencing, that is when he returned home to be with his family in Chicago, but then he did not show up for sentencing.
Where did he go instead?
He flew from Chicago to San Diego, and then I think according to his Journal to Freedom, he took a taxi to the Tijuana border. To the Tijuana and to get into Mexico, and then ultimately made his way to Mexico City.
I have this image in my head of like Ahmad like dragging a roller bag stuffed full of cash into Mexico. He
ultimately, for the viewers that don't know, he ultimately was apprehended in Pakistan. But according to his Journal to Freedom, and of course, once he was captured by Pakistani border authorities, he had on him, as you say, about $176,000 in U.S. currency. He had, I think, about 12,000 euros on him. And then he had a slew of different documentation. He had his U.S. passport and his key. He really was trying to get a Pakistani birth certificate. That's what he had been trying to get because he wanted to claim Pakistani citizenship.
He was born in Canton, Ohio.
He was born in Canton, Ohio, and working as an FBI agent in the Columbus office, it was easy to go down the street to the Ohio Department of Health and get the vital records. And
I did the same thing.
Produce his actual birth certificate. And of course, he had paid somebody, I believe, in Mexico City. In fact, I think it was a referral from his cab driver for...
According to my Journey to Freedom, he goes into Tijuana, he flies to Mexico City, he goes to the Pakistani embassy and says, I lost my identification, I need a new passport. And the embassy there is like, well, this is going to take a minute. And he gets frustrated and he goes out to Eduardo, his taxi driver, and says, hey, can you help me with these documents? So he flies to Lahore, Pakistan with the fake documents, and that's when he got intercepted.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then he was detained immediately. For your listeners, he was detained upon his arrival in Pakistan due to the fact that he had these multiple documents with him. And he was trying to claim that he should not be extradited back to the United States because he was a Pakistani citizen, and produced this document that said he was, I believe, born somewhere in Pakistan, in Lahore, I believe, Pakistan, when in reality he was not.
It's funny because like the journal that somebody might keep while they're fleeing on the lam normally wouldn't be released by the authorities, certainly in the United States. But in Pakistan, the authorities there released it to the local media. And so I remember calling up a reporter. I looked up the byline from somebody who was in Lahore who was covering this story. And I asked him to send me a copy of this journal. And he said, well, this guy says he's actually Pakistani. And I said, I'll send you a copy of his birth certificate. So that's how I ended up getting the journal.
Well, it's quite a read, I hear. I have looked at it. It's just been a minute or two since I've looked at it last. But it is quite interesting what he chronicled as he calls it, his journey to freedom. But in reality, he was just ditching his family and trying to not face justice for the guilty plea that he had entered into federal court.
Now, I recall that U.S. District Judge Michael Watson waited, I think, a year while Amer was in Pakistan and then ended up sentencing him in absentia. And in part because it's just so difficult to extradite somebody from Pakistan. Why is it so complicated?
I don't know the answer to that, but I do remember it was extremely difficult. And when we finally got word, and to just back up, you're spot on with your dates. Ahmad had pled guilty in December of 2013, and Judge Watson in Columbus, the federal district court judge, sentenced Ahmad in December of 2014. But it was not until, and again, he was captured in April of 2014. It was not until August of 2015, so well over a year, that extradition was approved by the Pakistani Federal Investigation Agency. And I remember multiple conversations with higher-ups both in our executive management as well as at the Department of Justice and Department of State. There were multiple agencies that needed to be involved. And luckily, we were finally able to get him extradited to bring him back to the States.
But in that interim year plus, did you ever think he was going to come back?
You just have no idea. You have no idea what the Pakistani authorities were going to do, if they were going to ultimately release him or if they were just going to keep him detained there. Obviously, we had hope that he would be extradited, but we just didn't know how this would resonate with the Pakistani authorities and if it was something that they would be willing to agree to.
Well, how did the FBI keep tabs on Ahmad while he was in Pakistan? Like, does the FBI has like foreign attaches?
We do. We have, in addition to our field offices around the country and our smaller offices around the United States called resident agencies, they are called attaches, and they're usually a FBI presence inside an embassy in various foreign countries strategically located around the world for matters just like this, where we need a physical presence to be able to deal with folks in country at the Secretary of State's office, with the Department of State, with military, other agencies, as well as our foreign counterparts. And so there was a lead that was assigned to this, to those folks that were located in country. And there was hope that we would get them back. We just didn't know how long it would take.
So I think after, like you said, it was like 15 months, agents flew to another Middle Eastern country to like meet him there? Or how was he brought back?
Well, and I may not have finished.
Sorry.
He was sentenced in absentia, and he did get a pretty significant hit, 15 years. So, which is a significant sentence for public corruption, white-collar offenses. And yes, there were regional security officers with the State Department who flew with Ahmad out of country and met him in the Middle East. And quite frankly, I can't remember if it was Dubai or Qatar or where it was exactly, but we had agents both from the FBI and our partners with the U.S. Marshal Service accompanied us as well, because that's really their forte, is fugitive apprehension and transport of prisoners. And they partnered with us to send over folks in a team. And ultimately, that's how we then brought him back from the Middle East.
So everybody else has already served their sentences, Alu and Hampton. Ahmad, for a long time, he was at a federal prison called Terminal Island in San Diego. I just checked recently, and it looks like he's been gone to a different facility that is designed for, pre-release type thing. Have you heard anything more from him?
I've not, and you're right. Some of these cases that we've worked, the last one we talked about on one of the podcasts was involving former representatives Carlton Weddington and Clayton Luckey. They were sentenced to 3 years in prison, but they've been released a long time ago. To your point, Mohammed Noor Alo, the immigration attorney, and Doug Hampton, they received sentences of about 4 years in federal prison. Joe Chivaroli, the lawnmower guy, I think he was about 1.5 years. So they've all been released from federal custody. But no, it's not uncommon, especially for nonviolent white-collar offenders, that as they're nearing the end of their term, that they're released to either a halfway house or a residential facility instead of being maintained in a medium or minimum security facility, just to help with transitioning them back into society.
So what do you think are the lessons to be learned from this Ahmad case?
Well, it floors me, the amount of commissions that were made and how, at least initially, Ahmad was able to deceive other subordinates and folks at the Treasury office, and how there weren't more checks and balances, where a relatively unknown trading firm, Hampton Capital Management, ends up getting the vast majority of the trade work on these. And these trades are tens of millions of dollars. And instead of JP Morgan Chase or William Blair, or again, other very large, big name institutional investors, that I never understood how there weren't other people that were more vigilant in identifying and understanding what was going on.
All right. Well, thank you again for reviewing this case and for joining us on Ohio Politics Explained.
You're welcome.